Okay, so when I read the description of this wonderful conference and I saw the term emergence, I thought that the term emergence, can you hear me well? Yeah. Is deeply problematic, as it can be a perfect manifestation of the modern colonial translation of geography into chronology, or we can say colonization of space via delocalized and disembodied time. This, of course, is one of the fundamental delusions imposed by the Western modernity onto the rest of the world, a specific spatial temporal matrix based on the invention of modernity and tradition as its dark other, on juxtaposing the new and the old, the modern and the traditional. And it is necessary to rethink this spatial temporal matrix within which the edited history of humanity is built on familiar myths of linear, successive, homogeneous historical development, on vectorial genealogies of culture, of knowledge, and the arts. This logic of modernity based on the invention of tradition, which is seen as modernity's dark evil, dark other, stitches through many discourses today, including the ones that are overtly constructed to question and destabilize progressivism. Therefore, we need to ask from the start from where and in which direction this emergence takes place, who emerges and why, in which logic the emergence is grounded in. Tradition as a constructed arbitrary notion was needed to counterbalance modernity and localize it in Western Europe. This was linked with the claim of the European system of knowledge production to make sense of everything and everybody that it encounters. In the first part of modernity, in the 16th through 18th century, it was expressed in a theological drive, while in the second circular modernity, it was expressed in a quasi-scientific inclination to classifications, taxonomies, evolutionary schemes, and various ecological parallels. In the basis of this comparative drive, there lied a universalist quest for the common origin of humanity, of all human beings. But the problem was what sort of human being was chosen to represent the humanity. It was, of course, at that point a recognizable white Christian modern male, as opposed to traditional savage of the wrong religion, sexual orientation, color of skin, or any other combination of such. So this wonderful Renaissance conception of man and mankind has remained the main instrument in disavowing the non-Christian and non-European knowledges until now. It emerged through and in the clashes between European Christians and their difference, such as Jews, Muslims, Amerindians, Africans, Asians. Such an understanding of the human being was necessary for giving the Europeans their desired privilege of the presumably objective rationality, while legitimating of the human taxonomy created by Europeans was epistemological, you can say, rather than ontological. It was, and is still, grounded in taxonomizing and ranking countries and regions, people, cultures, languages, and knowledges, according to the rhetoric of modernity, with its persistent underlying logic of coloniality, dividing the world into humanitas and anthropos, to quote Osamu Nishitani, who demonstrated how epistemic differences were translated into ontological ones when the anthropos was constructed as a position of the object, quote, absorbed into the domain of knowledge produced by humanitas. The asymmetrical relation between humanitas and anthropos is being continuously reproduced today. The former as the owner of knowledge, the latter as the owned object to be folded into the domain of knowledge, end of quote. In other words, anthropos is an other, but an other which does not exist ontologically. It's a discursive construct invented by the same in the process of constructing its sameness as in an act of enunciation, hiding the locality and the corporeality of the enunciator, to use Walter Mignola's semiotic wording. This division of the world into those who belong and those who do not belong to modernity, those who are rational subjects and those who stand closer to nature and lack the ability to think, and unfortunately continues today in the interpretation of, for example, the post-socialist world and its inhabitants who have never even started to speak, as Jennifer Suchlan pointed out in one of her recent texts. Now let's concentrate a little bit on such familiar concepts as Orientalism and progressivism. The notorious divisions into the modern and traditional, human and subhuman, sameness and otherness are still organized around the two main modes of interpreting the other. The Orientalist exclusion and absolute othering, and the presumably more humane and inclusive progressivism that prescribes the others what to do and how to change in order to start climbing the ladder of modernity, never of course hoping but always aspiring to catch up with its elusive zone of sameness. Shumei argues that efforts to criticize Orientalism or progressivism often come to nothing because they are aimed at questioning the fundamental discourses of modernity. This demonstrates a lack of willingness in the West to really understand or know the other. It is the ignorance and not the difference that is the reason for the lack of understanding. Today, Western intellectuals are aware of the possible accusations in Orientalism, of course, and this is why they delegated the task of imposing discursive universalism to diasporic scholars. Their criticism is formulated within the Western discursive frames and uses the established paradigms and well-known parameters. An artificial impression that there is nothing beyond the West, the Western discourse, is then restated and reinstated again. And this allows then the West to continue playing its role of the only producer of knowledge. What is the role of the other in this scenario then? She or he is first assigned a primitive temporality and then imbued with the mimetic desire to become similar to Western subject and catch up with the West once again. After social and political theory was forced to abandon such ideological and politically dubious concepts as third world, developing, transiting countries and regions, emergence has come to occupy their place as a milder and more blurred Aesophian manifestation of typically teleological developmentalism and modern thinking. It seems that we live in the time, actually, of such blurred, leaking and deliberately weak terms. Unhappy with many unsatisfactory posts, such as post-Fordism, post-modernism, post-colonialism, we're still left with very few options. To revamp and renovate this pictorial teleology, for instance, in the recently coined concept of alter modernity, or to attempt to radically delink from it and offer our various options for re-existence, grounded in transmodern thinking, and I will explain later what it's all about. Alter-modernity and transmodernity both attempt to discard the endless proliferation of posts and seem to offer a different path. At first sight, they both destabilize the usual linear march from modernity to postmodernity, which tends to cut off any branches that don't fit the simple unidirectional vector. However, in reality, alter-modernity is yet another edition of modernity, whereas transmodernity is an attempt to delink from it. So let me say a few words about alter-modernity first. That, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it's important to refresh it in your minds. The alter-modern paradigm, as you know, was made famous by Nicolas Bouillon, who in 2009 organized an exhibition under the same name in Tate Gallery in London. Alter-modernity, in fact, continues the naturalized progressivism as one of the identifying elements of modernity at large and reiterates the operation of replacing the global with the local, European, Western, subsequently presenting it in universal forms, deliberately delocalized terms. Bouillon claims that there is a homogeneous multitude of artists who by definition are regarded as contemporary subjects, no matter what spaces and local histories they come from. Similarly, he regards the implied homogeneous audience, which he assumes to be ready to make some collective sense and possess a necessary common vocabulary to do that. Thus, both social reality and art become, in this interpretation, oversimplified, and art is in the end equalized with the sphere of the quotidian, mundane, turning into a generator of artificial social environment in which the collective action of the imagined community of sense, to use Ranciere's formulation, is taking place. So, in fact, Bourdieu speaks of the Western subject of the exhausted modernity, of the subject who has become westernized and agreed to share the modern paradigm. He attempts to lift the opposition of the global and the local by means of yet another universalizing of modernity, which he imbues with a historical ambivalence that Bourdieu believes can protect it from both standardization and nostalgia. I must say that he came up with the concept before the exhibition in Tate. Already in 2005, he came up with the idea that artists are looking for a new modernity, grounded in translation of cultural values of particular groups into the global network. It is this process of reloading modernity and adapting it for the new globalization context that Bourdieu called altermodernism. His altermodern aesthetics has appropriated and politically neutered the concepts of transit and creolization, borrowed from the post-colonial genealogy of knowledge. He claims that both postmodernism and multiculturalism are now passé, and we're living in a homogeneous global culture of mixed and lost origins, marked by simplified and intensified contacts, journeys and migrations, translations and subtitles, a culture from which any artist, regardless of his or her genealogy, can borrow devices and techniques. So the main motive then of altermodernity is wandering in time, space and various media forms. Bourdieu doesn't alter the progressivist line of modernity. He simply prolongs it to the next stop, I would say, to the altermodern stop. The passenger of this train also stays the same. It's a modern, postmodern, altermodern subject. Developing the ideas of his manifesto, the critic proclaims as an aesthetic challenge of contemporary art a remaking of the montage of reality and a constant editing and reprogramming of everyday material in order to implement alternative and temporary versions of life, stressing the importance of unreliability of forever transitory elements of contemporary society, culture, and the institutes of group and individual behavior. Transmodernity, on the contrary, is a totally different story. It was first formulated by Enrique Dussel in 2002. It's a critical open utopia whose result is unknown. Transmodernity is turned in the direction of an uncertain future instead of legitimating the present. Transmodernity overcomes modernity in an analectic way, not only from the inside, but also from the outside or underside of modernity, as Dussel says, from the position of its subordinated other and its non-Western knowledge. So that's why Dussel comes up with another term, analectic or anadialectic, from Greek prefix meaning anti, which is the opposite of dialectic. The analectic moment is linked with the fact that each person or a group of people always exists beyond the horizon of totality. The analectic helps not to only negate the old, but also to launch the new, thus taking dialectic to its logical end. It opens a specific metaphysical sphere referring us to the other. The key category here is exteriority, understood not as a sphere of pure ontological difference outside, removed from or untouched by modernity, but it's different. It's an outside presented and constructed as a difference by the inside, by the dominant discourse. The voices of the others calling from this exteriority or from the border zone come from the outside of institutional and normative basis of the system and represent a challenge to this system. Transmodernity then strives to overcome the totality from the position of exteriority, questioning the Western assumption that all societies and all cultures must go through the modernizing stages that the West once has already passed to reach some forever deferred and blissful state of, I don't know, global postmodernity, or today maybe altermodernity. Dussel demonstrates, criticizing universalism and any claims that rational superiority, that postmodernists themselves remain within the temporal spatial matrix of modernity and focusing their criticism on time and not on space. For them, the problem with modern rationality lies not in its European or in Western nature, but in its modern contemporary spatiality. Therefore, most postmodern theories of the other remain declarative and sometimes manipulative in their construction of excuses for continuing ignorance and lack of any genuine interest in the other. Transmodernity is a theoretical concept, and also as a political and ethical claim, social changes, opens the spatial dimension of history and accentuates an historical and mental presence of the outside and the multiple non-Western transmodern memories, experiences, and knowledges. Transmodernity always draws the attention to geographic and body-graphic grounds of any knowledge, as opposed to the universal, delocalized, linear time of Western modernity. So, what happens when non-Western others realize that it's the same who made them others in order to dominate and violate in the name of modernity, then they can choose to take a radical step of decolonial delinking, and then transmodernity emerges as an other beyond modern space of thinking and action. A specific locus of enunciation in Walter Mignolo interpretation then emerges, linked to a particular geopolitics and body politics of knowledge, of being, of gender, perception, which are antagonistically yet inextricably connected with the Western modernity. So, a few words about the geopolitics and body politics of knowledge, because these are two important decolonial terms. The geopolitics and body politics of knowledge represent epistemic and political projects formulated by the experience and memories of historical agents who were erased as cognitive subjects. The geopolitics of knowledge refers to what? Local, spatial, and temporal grounds of knowledge. The body politics refers to individual and collective biographical grounds of understanding, of thinking, rooted in particular local histories and trajectories of origination and dispersion. So in this case, locality is seen and understood not merely as a geohistorical location, but also as an epistemic correlation with the sensing body, percepting the world from particular local history. If Foucauldian biopolitics deconstructs the management of power and its struggle for the right of interpretation, the decolonial body politics displaces epistemology from its Eurocentric location to the non-Western and non-hegemonic locales and bodies, which are marked by racial, sexual, religious, ethnic, and other differences, and this allows to render them as dispensable lives, subhumans, second-class citizens, and practitioners of condemned religions. The non-European people who have been denied this right and ability to think, who experience various forms of epistemic racism, are the ones who feel persistent power asymmetries in the production and distribution of knowledge in the most painful way. So they can identify with another important decolonial concept or slogan, which is a rethinking of the famous Cartesian cogito ergo sum. It's I am where I think. I am what I think. Principle which sets the stage for epistemic affirmations that have been disavowed. At the same time, it creates a shift in what can be called a geography of reasoning, geography of knowledge. For if the affirmation I am what I think is pronounced from the perspective of the epistemologically disavowed, it implies, and you too, addressed to the epistemology of the 0 point. In other words, we are all where we think, but only the European system of knowledge was built on the belief that the basic premise is I think, therefore I am, which was a translation into circular terms of the theological foundation of knowledge, in which we already encounter the privilege of the soul over the body to circular terms. The progressivist logic that we've been discussing so far, grounded in the modern colonial temporal spatial matrix, has a direct relation to knowledge and to knowledge production. Indeed, modernity is a knowledge-generating system above all. Modernity can be regarded as an idea that describes certain historical processes and needs a system of knowledge that legitimizes it. Once this idea is created, it legitimizes the system of knowledge that created it. The idea of modernity and the system of knowledge that legitimized it became a mechanism, a very effective mechanism to disavow other systems of knowledge and make other historical processes non-modern. The making of epistemic modernity then went hand in hand with epistemic coloniality, that is, with colonization of knowledge by either absorbing its content or by rejecting this knowledge. All knowledge which is not grounded, for example, in Greek or Latin or expressed in the 6 modern European languages became just an interesting object of study, expelled from the universal system of knowledge production, except the rules for political theory and economy, theology, philosophy, and literature and arts. This is how the darker side of modernity, which we call coloniality, works in the sphere of knowledge production. The system in which coloniality is embedded then created a meta-language, wherein its own affirmation went hand in hand with the justification to negate all other systems of knowledge that the meta-language described as non-modern or anti-modern. The rationale that legitimized the classification of humans and their ranking was not ontology again, but epistemology, a system of knowledge production created by Western Christians in European territory, considered the standard of humanity and of knowledge. In the basis of this skillful mechanism, there lied an important relation between the enunciation and the enunciated, which must be destabilized in order to disavow the rhetoric of modernity and its established geography of reasoning, with a focus on the enunciated and not on the enunciation. Shifting the geography of reasoning is crucial because there is an ideological assumption in epistemology according to which subjects who are not Euro-Americans are mere tokens of their own culture. This presupposition implies that knowledge is located in a given area, the West, and controlled by certain people, the circular Western quantitative minority. If we posit ourselves as epistemic subjects who take on the world from our own lived experience and education, and rather than being tokens of our culture, take as object of our study the Western imperial formations and Western Christian and circular elites, the measure of all possible knowledges and the picture of modernity is ontological, ethical, epistemic in its crisis, and it will look differently from what we used to reading. And here, another important concept that we need to take into account is a concept that was introduced by Colombian social philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez. He described it as the hubris of the 0 point, that is an arrogance generating from a secure vantage point from which the Western observer looks at the world. This Archimedean point is taken out of the observed world, making it impossible for the observer to be observed, and thus hiding the geopolitical and biopolitical circumstances of the Western point of view, theory, vision, and sensibility. And this strategy, of course, is continued to be used today, the hubris of the 0 point. The classification, the ranking of human beings uses this hubris of the 0 point system. The utter confidence in rational, calculable computer models pretending to understand reality, yet grounded in agonistics, we can say an agonistic principle in its most bare survival of the fittest competitive forms, attempts to shift our attention from the fact that there are other options than saving capitalism, for example, or saving the rhetoric of modernity with its inner logic of coloniality, for that matter. There are other kinds of life, different social and economic models and epistemic systems that need to be listened to, taken into account, and given an equal chance in the new architecture of the world. And progress, of course, should not be measured here not with quantitative indices of the GNP, but at least with subjective gratification of capabilities, to say the least. If we take one more step away from the rhetoric of modernity with its logic of coloniality, we'll see that development, defined by the think tanks of the global north and still regarded by Amartya Sen, for instance, as the main horizon of humankind, can be further questioned and counterbalanced with other ideals and notions which equally have the right to exist, yet being systematically suppressed and negated. And in this particular context, the post-socialist case is very interesting. The sanctification of disembodied progressivism as one of the powerful tools of modernity has naturalized emergence in its, I say, monosemantic, negative, for those who haven't yet emerged, understanding. Particularly painful for the post-socialist world that has largely been transferred from its previous semi-periphery or second world status to more and more subalternized societies today, who have been struggling with various emergence models for the last 25 years to no avail, and today gravitate more and more in the direction of the global south, or in the post-Soviet case, some paradoxical versions of, let's say, the south of the poor north. In their insightful book, which is called Of Divine Warning, Reading Disaster in the Modern Age, Jane and Louis Gordon suggest an internal connection of heavenly bodies and crisis. They write, quote, "It summons choices to be made. Since the results of making wrong choices could be catastrophic, these kinds of divine warning occasion not only anxiety and struggle of choices one must make, but also fear. The initial sign then warns of the catastrophe, but the disaster produces victims who are a continuation of the initial sign. They in effect become signs, carrying that plague, disaster, wherever they go. They become monsters." End of quote. There are more and more of such monsters created by liberal modernity today, and even ones belonging to the global north does not save anymore from the possibility of becoming such a monster overnight. The Gordons point out that racism and colonialism generated people marked as a continued sign of ill fate, that is, problem people. And I think that the post-Soviet space, for a number of reasons, has also become such a problem region, both for the outside and for the inside. Anyone today can become such a victim monster, yet the post-Soviet case is specific or even specifically doomed due to several reasons. The eerie sensation of being completely dropped out from the world system is represented in its clearest form in the case of Russia, which is in a state of mismatched multi-vector dysfunctionality, stuck in underexpressed models, unfinished decolonizations, interrupted repentance, and epistemic inconsistencies. This region is on the verge of going through a period of serious geopolitical turbulence, resulting in a possible drastic remapping or dismantling even of the country and its partition among various players. In this respect, of course, we have to go back a little bit to Orientalism and progressivism and remember the infamous Fukuyama's end of history discourse and the typical Western understanding of the post-Soviet as time and not as space. This rendered irrelevant and invisible dozens of millions of people who actually live in this space. But from our side, it's a different sensibility. It can be summarized in the phrase, what does it mean to be a void, to be nothing in the new architecture of the world? What does it mean to be aware of the fact that the second world narrative and history is over, the victory is granted to the presumed enemy, and no one really expects this defeated side to resurrect and pester the world with absurd claims to existence. At the same time, the validity of the concept post-socialist itself is being questioned more and more, together with the growing dispersal tendencies relocating the former socialist subjects along different vectors and within different alliances in the new world order. This is precisely the historical juncture at which the post-colonial ghost emerges at the background of the post-socialist drama. A complex and contradictory drama for sure, as it contains the initial euphoria of the post-socialist countries that felt that they were returning to the European bosom and soon discovered their secondary status in Europe. The more traditionally subaltern post-colonial fate of the non-European Soviet ex-colonies, and the bitter post-imperial Russian sense of defeat, dangerously transformed into today's imperialist revanchism. There can be a different interpretation of the end of history, not only Fukuyama's, when we speak of the post-Soviet and wider post-socialist world. It was summarized by Boris Groys in his idea of the radical and apocalyptic culmination as a gist of the socialist project, and I'm quoting. The end of history will come not with the victory of the market or of any possible political project, but on the contrary, with the determined victory of the political project, meaning a final rejection of the past and of the diversity of history. That is why the only real legacy of today's post-communist subject, its true motherland, is the denouncement of the past, the rupture with any historical tradition or cultural belonging. End of quote. So what Groys wants to stress here is that the communist modernity as a project went against the course of the world history. In a sense, it transcended it. When the project failed, we were all forced to come back to the usual established course, speed, and most importantly, direction of history, and to the camouflaged but recognizable mild progressivism as opposed to a radical socialist one. And this was interpreted by many people as a way backwards. Problem people, or in other words, people with negated humanity, become more and more frequent in global modernity coloniality, and Global coloniality, of course, is different from colonialism, though its origins go back to colonizations of the New World. Yet colonialism is a historical term, is a descriptive term, which does not attempt a deconstruction of epistemic and discursive grounds of the modern project, and seldom venture into the depths of the philosophy of science in order to manifest its dominant colonialist roots. Global coloniality, by contrast, continues long after colonialism is over and flourishes in unexpected spheres of modern disciplines, academic divisions, in the production and distribution of knowledge, as well as in historical and geopolitical situations that don't render themselves so obviously to any post-colonial interpretation. But of course, global coloniality is also manifested in particular local forms, conditions, and at the same time remains a recognizable connecting thread for the wholesome perception and understanding of otherwise meaningless and dissociated manifestations of modernity. So if we speak of the institutional involvement of post-colonial and post-socialist fields, leaving aside for now the sensibilities that lie behind, we'd have to agree with the two authors that you might be familiar with, Sharanchari and Catherine Berderi, who state that over time, post-socialism came to signify a critical standpoint in several senses. Critical of the socialist past and of possible socialist futures. Critical of the present, as neoliberal verities about transition, markets, democracy were being imposed upon former socialist spaces. And critical of the possibilities for knowledge as shaped by Cold War institutions. Here, post-socialist studies began to converge somewhat with the agenda of post-colonial studies. Just as post-coloniality had become a critical perspective on the colonial present, post-socialism could become a similarly critical standpoint on the continuing social and spatial effects of Cold War power and knowledge. However, I think that belated dialogue between the two posts receives an unsatisfactory explanation in most of the existing interpretations. Why? Because they're still marked by progressivism. Hence, the conclusion that the post-socialist condition is newer, and it's easy for the post-socialist researchers to borrow ready-made post-colonial terms. Or, sometimes we read that it will take them some time to develop their own concepts. This seems a bit oversimplified to me. The post-colonial studies needed 3 decades, of course, to shape into a separate area of research, yet they have been quickly institutionalized in academia, whereas their main practitioners from the start have been the post-colonial others themselves, who made it to the West. A quarter of a century after the collapse of the socialist system makes today's situation indeed close to this model, and some researchers assume that soon a vigorous post-socialist studies would emerge. But the post-socialist discourse has never been legitimized other than in the area studies form in the West, and later in the semi-periphery, supported by the Western grants. The previous trajectories of knowledge were completely erased, and the scholars who wanted to join the global knowledge production were offered to start from scratch, ignoring both the previous general socialist experience and knowledge as outdated, as ideologically corrupt sometimes, and also particularly in the case of non-European colonies, they had to ignore their own local histories and genealogies. So again, we find a progressivist analogy between the post-colonial and the post-socialist that has to be interpreted with caution to avoid assuming once again that all people, all countries, all discourses must go through a similar logic of development that is set by the Western modernity and the Western way of thinking. In the Cold War University, if you remember, social sciences took the central position both in the imperial Western version of meta-theoretical models and in their colonial and applied version of area studies. What about the socialist world? It was studied somewhere in between, but closer, of course, to the area studies colonial variant, whereas after this collapse and the redistribution along different lines, the post-socialist world could not fit the architecture of knowledge of the emerging post-Cold War corporate university. Some of its parts indeed drifted in the direction of the object of study within the area studies, and this shift is obvious, for example, in David Chone-Moore's PMLA article applying post-colonial theory to post-socialist reality. In response to the mainstream reading of the post-socialist as a void and the post-colonial analogizing of the post-socialist, there emerged a number of alternative definitions of concepts and ideas, and one of them is the one that I already mentioned, the Sharanchari and Catherine Berderi's idea of the post-Cold War studies. Another interesting one, discourse that I don't have time now to discuss, is a post-dependence discourse which is formulated in Poland. Okay, I'm going to skip this critique of Sharap and Verderi, and we can come back to it later in questions if you're interested. And I would like to say a few words about emergence beyond progressivism. Is it possible? We can at least attempt to interpret emergence outside the progressivist modern thinking, and consequently not as a way of building oneself into the existing modern hierarchy, and look at possible ways of delinking from the rhetoric of modernity. And here, a decolonial critique and resematization of emergence can come at hand. The main task of decolonial option is a critical analysis of modernity and its darker side, coloniality, tracing the genealogy of modernity's violence in relation to its internal and external others, and restoring the alternative genealogies of decolonial struggles in order to offer ways of delinking from modernity, coloniality, and decolonizing about being, knowledge, and perception. Decolonial option combines a lot of various elements of the world system analysis, critical race and ethnic studies, women of color, feminism, with themes and issues typical for post-colonial works, and accentuates not the historical description of colonialist strategies, but rather the long-lasting traces in ontology, in axiology, and epistemic spheres that are left after any colonialism is over. So delinking from the existing system of knowledge production, disciplinary spheres, epistemic modes, decolonial option attempts not to study colonialism, but to decolonize knowledge, subjectivity, gender, sensuality from the position of the border. The colonial option is undermining the epistemic grounds and principles of modernity, and not just adding and describing various regions or phenomena through generally accepted and shared means, such as post-structuralism or post-Marxism, and within universally accepted scholarly myths, such as modernity, progress, development, democracy, human rights, gender equality. But instead of that, global coloniality defines the commonality of various post-dependence experiences, but how to understand the existing intersections between post-dictatorship, post-colonial, post-40s, and post-socialist remains an open question, of course. These intersections stem from the very nature of modernity, yet they are not always unproblematically connected with its darker colonial side. And so I think it's very important here not to withdraw into one's own local standpoint experience of oppression, but to create conditions for some kind of altered global vision and transversal coalitions of struggle against all modern and colonial forms of dependence. The intersection of post-colonial, post-socialist, and other similar experiences of unfreedom is possible to understand by means of multi-spatial hermeneutics, crossing spaces or traditions which don't have common models of understanding and understandability, and which do not belong to our horizon. The emergent decolonial community of sense unites those who were marked by the classical unsaldo and colonial wound, and those who suffered the totalitarian or dictatorship suppression in a common mechanism of realizing one's own humiliation or one's complicity in the humiliation of others on local level and global level. A meticulous investigation of the sensibility of rejection, exclusion, resistance, overcoming, repentance, re-existence at the difficult birth of the liberated, independent, and finally grown up and responsible humanity. Let me say very briefly a few words about re-existence. The common denominator in many post-dependence cases will be getting rid of the trauma, not necessarily colonial trauma. It can be a trauma of imperial difference, typical for the Russian sensibility, for instance. It can be an experience of a second-rate European from Eastern Europe who for centuries have been multiply dependent on various empires. After a careful deconstruction of one's exclusion experience, it's regenerated and reworked into another view, often grounded in what a Colombian thinker and artist Adolfo Alban Quinter calls re-existence, a step from a negative and often violent model to a creation of an alternative reality grounded in remaking, revamping of those forms of interaction with the world, of sensing, of being that have been negated and erased by and in modernity. So re-existence for me is first of all a sensuous response to the violence of modernity and building our own existence around and inspired. The existence is performed from the position of exteriority that I touched upon earlier, or from border existence and thinking, which is an important concept, of course. Border existence, border thinking, border consciousness made famous by Chicana theories such as Jerry Moraga and Gloria Saldua. Critical border thinking is a constant negotiation and a state of being neither nor, or neither here nor there, a product of a complex and dynamic interaction with modernity that corresponds to the philosophic concepts of exteriority, the outside created from the inside, as interpreted by Enrique Dussel. And another concept, just to finish this conversation, is to mark outside. Maybe not many of you are familiar with it. Another promising move in reimagining emergence from a critical border perspective and a non-Western epistemology, cosmology, is to mark outside, theorized by several decolonial thinkers, including Rolando Vázquez. In Quechua language, to mark outside means to live in harmony and plenitude, but not material plenitude. To take part in the viable collectivity of a cosmic nature, that is, in a close mutual correlation with nature. This has nothing to do with sustainable development in the Western understanding, as it's opposed to progress, to modernization and development in such competitive forms that we are all used to. The plentiful, harmonious life is not a life of an impetuous and thoughtless consumer for whom material welfare is the only criterion of happiness. So mark outside does not refer to people who are always trying to live better than their neighbor, and who ground their lives in commercialization of all spheres and exploitation of nature. So mark outside, according to Vázquez and other interpreters, is grounded in the idea of human community in its harmonious and balanced relations with nature, being necessarily part of it and not objectifying nature in any way. Such a relationality is important. It's a relationality on a deeper level, questions the modern dichotomous thinking and anthropocentrism, rejecting appropriation and representation as the main two modes of modernity. Vázquez even claims that rationality precedes difference as such, as a condition for the very possibility of difference. Such a relation of thinking precedes the subject, the object, and even being itself, because reality and object then are seen as a relation always, and knowledge and learning restore their experiential nature and their close links with existence. So mark outside is a process of living in all its plenitude and its dynamic correlationism of mutual interdependence, and not a good life or living well as it is usually translated into European languages, immediately linking this concept with material characteristics, with the principle of acquiring objects, services, goods, and hence with feeling happiness only if you can buy all that. So mark outside rejects the modern idea of the human being as a czar of nature, which is then seen separately from human history. Nature is a part of history, but its role cannot be taken to just production in the narrow economic sense, because nature is also a crucial part of social being. Hence, to mark outside allows us to question the teleology of development and the priority of the economic growth over politics and society. This is opposed to the mainstream interpretations of freedom, which is usually seen through the concepts of production as needs, so that development is often presented as a liberation of humanity from the indigence, with the help of the free market, with the universal socialist regulator. Even in critical dependency theories and uneven exchange theories, the modern epistemology, with its linear time and homogeneous space, is very seldom questioned, while economy is often seen as presupposing the maximizing behavior of individualized subjects. In such a model, according to Pablo Davalos, difference is possible, but alternatives are not possible. Within the mark outside model, plentiful and harmonious life itself is realized in a myriad of options, and there is no one path anymore to be followed by everyone in the world. This principle is, in a sense, an economic of solidarity, we can say, echoing the more well-known economic of happiness, measuring progress not on quantitative parameters or GNP, but rather in capability approach, for example. This leads to a model which is politically determined by the demands of production and reproduction of human life, and life as such. This is by ecology, economy, and culture, within ecology, economy, and culture. Then we have to admit the ontological presence of other beings, not necessarily human beings, who have the right to a decent life as well. Or the inhabitants of exteriority of millions of people who are not consumers in the modern sense, who follow different ethics and intersubjective models and continue their links with collective memory, eroded and erased by modernity, and are not in favor of, for example, legalistics and individualism. These principles ground the idea of plentiful life not in materiality, but in specific moral principles, both societal and individual. An important part here is played by respect for any life and any labor, whereas the quality of life is rethought in accordance with the ethics of care, of course, so that monetary and material dimensions give way to social relations and solidarity, not only among the people, but again among all living beings and nature at large. So, to sum up, I would like to say that it's urgent to develop these kind of decolonial communities of sense on all levels in order to create an open, fluid, pluritopic, that is multispatial conceptual realm, with a nomadic mode of thinking, rejecting linearity, rejecting causality, marked by creative realization of theory, and having a wide enough and shifting vocabulary, allowing for a meaningful dialogue with these porous critical discourses. Neither of them can claim a universal status, yet no one's knowledge would be excluded or appropriated anymore, and each of them will be able to add valuable insights to the pluriversal critical exchange on the crucial questions of subjectivity, agency, emancipation of thinking, of knowledge, of being, of gender, of course, of perception, in today's global, transmodern context. Okay, thank you.
So now we have about 15 minutes for questions. So who would like to start?
The microphone.
Do you need the microphone or? Okay. Okay.
I have another one, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I actually have a question about post-socialism as this critical point, right? So this idea of post-socialism as critical in three different senses, right? Critical of Cold War modernity, critical of neoliberalism. Okay, so this post-socialism as a point of critique in these three senses: critique of neoliberalism, critique of Cold War, and the first one, unfortunately. Right. So, is it the actual state of affairs, or is it what we want post-socialist studies to become? Because I don't see actually post-socialist studies in general terms as critical in these three senses. If they were already that critical, then many problems would be solved, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I totally agree with you. This was a quotation from Sharad Chari and Catherine Berdel, who wrote an article about several years ago, and it's always quoted. It's always used in all discussions of post-socialist studies or emergence studies, whatever. And I am very skeptical about this article. First of all, because these authors, I have a problem with their positionality. They write it from the Western perspective, and there is this feeling that, again, they're studying us as insects. They want to see what is happening in this post-socialist space. Second, I have a problem with their too narrow Marxist perspective, that sometimes, they're blind to any other options and possibilities. I like Marxism, especially in its modern forms, but at the same time, I think it's outdated to kind of focus only on that, because there are other things happening in the world. That's another thing. And the third thing is that I think that you cannot start any kind of conversation about post-socialism or post-socialist states from the Cold War. It didn't start then. The Cold War was just the final stage of it, the stage of development. You have to take into account what happened before, what were the relations between empires and colonies before, what was the situation like, for example, in 1917 and 1945, because there are a lot of historical things that complicate the story and the situation. And you're quite right to say that this kind of discourse has to emerge from the post-socialist subjects themselves. They have to be critical about our own experience and formulate it. We cannot just sit there and wait until some American scholars formulate this for us once again, But at the same time, there are some interesting American scholars who are reflecting on that, like the one I quoted, Jennifer Suchlan. She's an American political scientist, but younger, not from the Cold War. And so she comes up with quite critical ideas, for example, of how Sovietology developed before, and she criticizes the American and the Western European Sovietology, and its fixation, for instance, on the ideas of dissent and dissidence, and so she kind of deconstructs that in a very fresh way. So a dialogue is possible with them, but I'm just against the idea that it's the West again that has to come up with some kind of ready-made post-socialist theory and just give it to us and then we work with it. No, we have to do it ourselves. It's our task.
Madina, thank you. There's so much to take from that, I barely know where to begin, but my question comes from my reading of Pinheiro and Stenger's work on capitalist sorcery, because they start with the same problem, another life is possible. And their their understanding of that, another life is possible, is that we have to recognise this as an event, and that the recognition of an event is difficult, but then how to respond, we should not know how to respond either. And within that, the trickery of capital is not its making up of subjects as void, perhaps, as much as you've illustrated, but to have the architecture of knowledge to make up subjects as minions that can do the work of dispelling and spelling the event, another life is possible, so that we can't recognise it even as an event. So my question then is, do you think it is possible, is meaningful to have emergence as conjuring, as spellcraft, as witchcraft, to kind of protect us from becoming these subjects as minions that do the work of spelling and dispelling the event, another life is possible?
Well, for one thing, I don't think in terms of events. It's not one of the concepts I use, although I'm familiar with all these wonderful texts written about that, but I don't use it. I'm a decolonial thinker, so I use other concepts. Well, do you mean to say that if it's not an event, then we shouldn't think about it, or we shouldn't imagine it, or what?
I think that in what I hear from your talk and my reading of Pinheiro and Stenger's is the similarity is colonialism, right? So I think, although it's different contexts, you're talking about geopolitics, they're talking about technoscience. And so the minions acting on behalf of neoliberalism are the experts that tell us, no, we can't have interspecial relations on ethical grounds because we know that insects are different, or we know that animals, quadrupeds, are different somehow. These are the minions that prohibit us from recognising the event of knowing that another life is possible. So here I see the similarity in colonialism.
Okay. Colonialism in relation to other species, you mean, to other forms of life?
Yeah, and so for things, they find magic and witchcraft as a possibility.
No, I think it's a totally Western view, because if you go to Quechua people and talk to them, you will find out that they see it differently. They don't see a difference between themselves as some kind of higher species and quadrupeds. It's a Western thing that has been internalized by many of us, yeah, but I think we have to work with it. We must.
Thank you very much.
I pressed the mute button.
Okay. Thank you very much for this talk. I have a question. I mean, I fully understand the idea of bringing in colonial or post-colonial theory, especially when it comes to the academic discourse. But I'm wondering now, I don't know much about Russia, but thinking about Russia and colonialism, how does it actually apply to Russia itself? So, Russia is a colonial power in itself. So
Okay.
So you associate it constantly with respect to the, you speak a lot about the Western, but maybe Russia to some extent is a Western kind of colonial power also?
No.
With respect to other states? I don't know, I'm asking you. So turning kind of the lens lens around onto Russia?
Okay, well, of course it's a very long story, and I can refer you to many texts that you can read, because there are really good historical texts about that, and also some colonial texts, because I've been working on this a lot also, and some of my colleagues in Eastern Europe also worked on that. So that's why I said that Russia is marked by imperial difference. Imperial difference is the difference between various kinds of empires. There are first-class empires like Great Britain or France that are capitalist modern empires that in second modernity establish the leading roles, right, in the world. And there are second-class empires like Russia, Ottoman Sultanate, not second class in the sense that they are bad or worse, but in the sense that they were not able to catch up, let's say, yeah? They were not able to reach the similar positions. And so they were constantly feeling that they were interpreted by the Western empires and by the West as inferior. And that's why already in the 18th century, by the 18th century, especially by the 19th century, in the Russian sources, you find a lot of these inferiority complexes, like we would like to be European, we're almost European, but we're not treated as Europeans. And I mean, I won't go into details here, but you can take anything. Take Dostoevsky's quote, which I like very much. In the 1880s, he was writing in his diary during the colonization of Pakistan, Central Asia. He was writing, in Europe, we were hangers-on and slaves. In Asia, we will go as masters. So you see this, it's a very interesting division, and that's why I call it a Janus-faced empire, because there's one face looking in the direction of the West, always kind of not quite sure of themselves, and a different face looking to the Caucasus or Central Asia, which are like Indians or like, you know, Orientals, treated like that. And then Russia was mimicking all these Western discourses, just taking the French model, the British model, and trying to impose it in a very caricature way. Because if you look at it, for example, I was recently reading Pushkin, who was at the Caucasus, you know, fighting at the war. He was saying that we're not doing all we can. We should really civilize the savages here in the Caucasus. We should send more samovars and Bibles here. So yeah, it's really interesting how a lot of these civilizing discourses are made. But what I mean is, yes, Russia is an imperial country, of course, yes, and it has different relations with different colonies, also depending on how European they were. If they were less European or more European than Russia itself. And so it has to do with that. But also there are other theories that I advise you to read, like there is Atkins' book on internal colonization that was published recently, and here in this book he discusses the so-called internal colonization, which is referring not to the others, not to the racialized others, not to others, but to their own population, to the Russians, the ethnically Russian people. And also today a lot of post-socialist people and post-Soviet people think that we are all in the situation of post-colonial people, in the global coloniality, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we are nowhere, we're in the void. We are neither in the north nor in the south. And so very often we are treated as post-colonial subjects. This is especially clear in socialist countries, former socialist countries case, I would say.
So now Elena, then Katie, and then if we have time, Veda, and we finish there.
Madina, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just wondering, what is your attitude to the concept of consensual empire introduced by Hart and Negri? Consensual empire. Consensual empire. Yes, which actually neglect the issue of space and locality in terms of what you said. And in this sense, do you think that Russia and other socialist countries, post-socialist countries, are part of this consensual empire, or how it's possible to somehow introduce in other discourse, non-Western discourse in such circumstances? Thank you.
Well, it's a difficult question for me, because I've been really forcing myself and trying to read Hart and Negri. And I did. I read all these 3 books, the famous trilogy, but I have never been able to find anything to link with in the discourse, because for me it's all too kind of still coming from, emanating from the Western mind, even if critical and leftist, okay? And there were some efforts on the part of Harvard and Negri, especially Hart, to come into dialogue with decolonial option, because in the last book they actually borrow one of our concepts connected with coloniality of power, without saying where it comes from, but it's another story. But anyway, I think that conceptual empire is a good term here, actually. It can work. But since I'm always looking at everything from the position of exteriority, from the position of the border, I don't think it actually changes any power relations. In the sense that people who are denied their humanity, they will be denied again. I mean, they will stay in the same situation of no humanity, of problem people, or people seen as problems, let's say, even in a consensual empire. But if we speak in institutional terms, in terms of states, then probably yes, Russia can negotiate its place there. But in order to do that, it has to be wise. It has to be done in a different way, not in such a confrontational way we are trying to do now.
Okay. I would have a question. Thank you for a very enriching talk. I would have such a question, and how decolonial theory would treat certain non-modern or anti-modern theories or non-humanist, inhumanist theories that had been generated in the latest 20 years back in the West and are disputing the anthropocentric and Eurocentrist positions. And this started from feminist theory. This was part and parcel of actor network theory of Bruno Latour, and later this was part of Rosa Braidotti's nomadic post-humanism, etc. So these theories were already dislocating and displacing the central position of Eurocentrist subject, of subjectivity as such, and at the same time disputing modernity. Plus, we have the new notion of contemporaneity, which is already not the issue of the world, because the world and worlding was the position of modernity, whereas contemporaneity deals with this dispersed and hybridized globality.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a wonderful question. Actually, I've been working a lot on this recently, on this kind of connections, interconnections, and opacities between post-humanism, anti-humanism, and decolonial interpretations. If you ask a decolonial radical thinker like Walter Mignolo, he would say no, we have nothing in common. But I am different in that respect, probably because I've read a lot of texts by Braidotti and I like him very much, especially her latest works, like the book, I think, from 2015, which is called Post-Human. I found it very good and refreshing. I think there are a lot of things that intersect there. But it's just, again, it's a question of the positionality, of geopolitics of knowledge, again, from which position you're doing it. Of course, Braidotti is doing it from her own vantage point, and I'm not criticizing her in that. I mean, of course, she's a European, well-established feminist, and it's great that she's doing this kind of thing, being privileged and all that. While we are still doing it, of course, from our own, I don't know, global self position, which is different. But there is an important difference here that I would like to stress. It comes from another scholar who is not known in the West at all. It's a woman, a philosopher from Jamaica called Sylvia Winter. And she has been also working for over 30 years on the question of what is human, what is humanism, anti-humanism, post-human, of course in her own terms. And one of her dictums is like, it's too early to kind of get rid of humanism. Because there are a lot of people in this world who have not been treated as humans. And so we need to first kind of rethink the idea of what is humanism like. It doesn't have to be Western humanism that Braidotti debunks or other people. It can be a different idea of the human. And that's why Sylvia Winter calls her work, one of her books, after the man towards the human. And it's very famous in the English-speaking world, and especially in this kind of the colonial and post-colonial thinking and Caribbean thinking. But it's interesting for me now always to kind of detach myself a little bit from all that and see like people are thinking about very similar ideas, but they word it in their own ways, let's say, and of course they formulate it from their own positions. But a dialogue is possible there and should happen. And this is one of the things I want to work on now, so I'm interested in this.